Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where the darkest truths of history are uncovered and retold with chilling clarity. Tonight, we enter the horrifying world of Jeffrey Dahmer, a name forever etched into America's criminal past. Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Dahmer's crimes shocked the world for their brutality, secrecy, and sheer inhumanity. Behind closed doors, in the quiet of his apartment, he carried out acts so disturbing that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. This is not just the story of a killer, it is the story of a monster hiding in plain sight, deceiving neighbors and authorities alike. It began quietly, like many stories of darkness often do, with a boy who seemed ordinary on the outside, but carried within him a hunger that words could not explain. Jeffrey Dahmer was born into a family that appeared normal, but even from a young age there were signs of detachment, signs that something deep inside him was different. He was fascinated with death, collecting bones of small animals and studying their structure, as if searching for meaning in lifeless things. While other children played freely, Dahmer's interests turned toward what most would avoid, and that fascination only grew stronger as he got older. His loneliness became a shadow that followed him everywhere, and his inability to connect deeply with others created a world where isolation and curiosity merged into something darker. By the time he was a teenager, alcohol had already become his escape. He drank heavily, even during school, hiding bottles in lockers and backpacks. Teachers noticed but often dismissed it as teenage rebellion. Yet beneath that haze was a growing obsession with control. He was drawn to the idea of having someone completely powerless before him, not just companionship but possession. His imagination carried him into dangerous territory, fantasies that would eventually spill into reality. In 1978, shortly after his parents' divorce, when he was left alone in the family home for weeks, his desires overcame his hesitation. One evening he encountered Stephen Hicks, a young hitchhiker on the side of the road who was simply trying to reach a concert. Dahmer pulled over, offered him a ride, and invited him to his house for drinks. At first it seemed harmless, two young men chatting, laughing, sharing beer, but behind Dahmer's calm exterior, his thoughts churned darker. Hicks mentioned wanting to leave, and that one sentence was enough to trigger the storm inside. Dahmer could not bear the thought of being left alone again, of losing the company he so desperately craved. He picked up a dumbbell and struck Hicks before strangling him to death. In that moment, the fantasy became real, and the silence of the house was broken, not by voices but by violence. He later dismembered the body, scattering bones and hiding pieces in ways that even he could barely process. The act itself was not driven by rage, but by a terrifying desire to hold on to someone forever, to prevent abandonment at any cost. That first killing planted a seed that never left him, though. For nearly a decade, Dahmer managed to keep his urges at bay, working various jobs, drifting through life and burying the memories under layers of alcohol and denial. Yet the hunger was never gone. It lingered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. When he finally settled in Milwaukee, years later, renting a small apartment in the Oxford Apartments complex, the facade of normalcy returned to cloak the darkness within that building, filled with working-class tenants, families, and individuals who trusted one another. Jeffrey Dahmer blended in as the quiet man who kept mostly to himself, polite enough to neighbors, never causing loud disturbances. He appeared harmless, almost invisible, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But the silence of his apartment was never innocent. Neighbors sometimes complained about foul smells that seeped through the vents, odors he dismissed as spoiled meat or plumbing issues. They noticed the sound of drilling late at night or heavy thuds that echoed through the walls, but they accepted his excuses, believing him to be nothing more than an odd neighbor trying to manage his own affairs. The truth was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Inside those four walls, Dahmer was building a private world of horror and ritual, creating a space where no one could interfere and where his fantasies could thrive unchecked. He began inviting men back to his apartment, most of them young and vulnerable men who trusted too easily or had nowhere else to go. He offered them money for photographs, drinks, or simply companionship, and once inside his home, their fate was sealed. It started with drinks laced with sedatives rendering them powerless. Then Dahmer would act out his desires in silence, each crime leaving him both satisfied and tormented. He photographed the bodies at different stages, as if trying to preserve the illusion of control, to freeze time itself. His apartment became a gallery of despair, a place where the line between life and death blurred, and where he alone decided who stayed and who disappeared. To outsiders, Dahmer appeared ordinary enough. He shopped for groceries, he chatted briefly with the building manager, he occasionally smiled at strangers on the street. There was nothing about his appearance that screamed danger, and that was what made him so terrifying. He was the embodiment of evil hiding in plain sight, able to cloak his monstrosity under the skin of normalcy. His neighbors would later recall how they sometimes saw young men entering his apartment, but rarely, if ever, leaving. They wondered, they whispered, but no one confronted him, no one imagined the full truth. The few times suspicion grew, Dahmer's calm explanations dissolved doubts, convincing those around him that he was nothing more than an eccentric man with bad housekeeping. What no one knew was that Dahmer's isolation was feeding the monster inside him. Each new victim was a desperate attempt to fill a void he could never satisfy, a hunger not just for flesh, but for possession. He did not simply want company, he wanted control, total and permanent control. And in his twisted logic, death was the only way to ensure no one could abandon him. His quiet nature, his unassuming manner, his ability to appear harmless, allowed him to continue unchecked as his crimes escalated. His apartment smelled of chemicals, the freezer was filled with horrors. Neighbors recoiled at the strange behavior, yet the mask he wore never slipped enough for anyone to truly see through. If the apartment itself became a prison not just for his victims, but for Dahmer as well. He lived within a self-made nightmare, surrounded by reminders of what he had done, Polaroids stuffed in drawers, bones hidden in containers, organs preserved in jars, each item a token of his obsession. And yet when he walked outside, he could still smile, faintly still nod politely, still return to his role as the quiet man next door. The duality of his existence was perhaps the most chilling aspect of all, for no one suspected that one of the most notorious killers in American history was living among them, renting a modest unit in a working-class neighborhood, paying rent on time and blending in with chilling perfection. Inside that apartment, Jeffrey Dahmer allowed his darkest compulsions to take form in ways that defied all human comprehension. He had carefully crafted an environment where his fantasies could no longer be separated from reality, and once someone stepped through his door, they were unlikely ever to leave alive. His method was cold, calculated, and disturbingly ritualistic. He often targeted men who were vulnerable, those struggling financially, those disconnected from family, or simply those seeking a place of belonging. He would approach them with offers that seemed harmless sometimes, just to hang out, share a drink, or pose for photographs in exchange for a small amount of money. The simplicity of his invitations masked the horrifying fate that awaited them once they crossed the threshold. The drinks he offered were rarely just drinks. They were laced with sedatives powerful enough to render his guests unconscious within minutes. Dahmer thrived on this moment of complete helplessness, for it gave him exactly what he longed for: total control. He could position their bodies however he wanted. He could speak to them, touch them, photograph them, and they could do nothing to resist. His obsession was not simply with murder, but with possession and permanence. He wanted people not as living companions, but as objects frozen in time, unable to leave or betray him. His Polaroid collection grew with each victim, dozens of images capturing the silent stages of his crimes, some showing the men alive before sedation, others depicting them in the process of being dismembered. These photographs were not souvenirs in the ordinary sense. They were part of his attempt to build a world where he could revisit and relive his control whenever he wished. The apartment itself became a house of horrors. Neighbors would later learn that nearly every corner contained evidence of his crimes. The refrigerator contained human heads and hearts preserved in bags, as if they were leftovers for later. Meals. The freezer stored flesh neatly wrapped while large blue barrels filled with acid stood in his bedroom, used to dissolve bodies until nothing but sludge remained. Jars lined with organs sat hidden in closets, trophies he kept not just to remember, but to feel that his victims were still somehow with him. He admitted later that eating parts of his victims was his way of making them part of him forever, a chilling attempt to keep them close in the most grotesque way possible. His crimes escalated. As his fantasies grew bolder, no longer content with simple possession, he began to experiment with horrifying attempts to create living zombies, drilling holes into the skulls of sedated victims and injecting chemicals in a desperate attempt to enslave them forever. Yet to the outside world, Dahmer remained a quiet man who blended into the fabric of Milwaukee life. He shopped for groceries, he occasionally greeted neighbors in the hallway, he even joked lightly with a few people when pressed. His building was full of families and working people who wanted to believe the strange smells coming from his apartment were nothing more than spoiled food or bad plumbing. When they confronted him, he always had an excuse: meat gone bad, chemicals. For cleaning fish, a refrigerator problem. His calm manner and quiet voice convinced them every time. No one wanted to imagine the truth that in apartment 213 unspeakable horrors were unfolding nightly right under their noses. The young men who walked into his home had no idea of the fate awaiting them. Many trusted him simply because he seemed ordinary, not threatening. Dahmer would sometimes go to clubs or bars to find his victims slipping easily into conversations, offering them drinks or money. For photographs, his shy demeanor worked in his favor because no one suspected his true intentions. To them he was just a slightly awkward man looking for company. To him they were the next addition to his collection, another piece of his twisted puzzle, another chance to satisfy the hunger that consumed him. The moment they stepped inside the apartment, the outside world vanished, and they became part of his private nightmare. As the killings continued, Dahmer's confidence grew. He no longer felt the need to hide the evidence as carefully as before. Instead, he lived among it, coexisting with the remains, as though they were his roommates. The smell grew worse, the noises more frequent, but he continued to mask them with excuses. When one neighbor complained, he even offered her sandwiches that some later feared may have contained human meat, though this was never proven. The thought alone was enough to haunt those who lived nearby. Once the truth finally emerged, some neighbors reported hearing screams or strange mechanical noises, but whenever they asked, Dahmer explained it away with a calm smile, and they accepted his words. It was this mask of normalcy that allowed him to keep killing for so long. The rituals themselves were driven by more than lust or violence. They were Dahmer's attempt to conquer the loneliness that haunted him since childhood. He admitted later that he did not want his victims to leave him, that he wanted to keep them close forever. He even fantasized about creating a shrine in his apartment, using bones and skulls as centerpieces, a place where he could surround himself with eternal company. The shrine never came to completion, but investigators later found boxes filled with skulls, bleached and prepared for display. It was not merely murder, it was a twisted form of art in his mind, a grotesque construction of permanence where human lives became decoration. Still, the duality of Jeffrey Dahmer remained one of the most chilling aspects of his story. By day he was an employee working quietly at a chocolate factory, blending into the routine of daily life. By night he was a predator, luring men into his lair, dismantling their bodies and preserving their remains. He attended family gatherings. Occasionally he spoke politely to his father over the phone. He even joked with co-workers at times. No one in his immediate circle could reconcile the man they thought they knew with the horrors that were unfolding in his apartment. It was as if two versions of him existed side by side, the ordinary man and the cannibalistic killer, and he switched between them with terrifying ease. The sense of dread grew in the neighborhood as more people noticed the foul odors spreading from his unit, and the strange comings and goings of men who were never seen again. But suspicion was not enough to break the illusion. He had carefully crafted explanations that deflected blame, and his ability to remain calm under questioning allowed him to continue. For the men he brought home, the drinks, the laughter, and the promises were just the opening act to a nightmare they could never escape. Each photograph, each preserved organ, each ritual added to the dark legacy that was being built quietly, behind locked doors, until the day fate would finally intervene. The night of July 22, 1991, began like so many others for Jeffrey Dahmer, but it would become the night that shattered the world he had built brick by brick in secrecy. For months he had been spiraling deeper into his compulsions, careless in his methods, leaving behind a trail of missing men and whispers that circled through the neighborhood but went unanswered. That evening, he approached 3 men, offering them money to pose for photographs in his apartment. His charm was quiet, his voice steady, and even though there was something unsettling about him, he managed to convince one of them, Tracy Edwards, to come back with him. Edwards did not know that stepping into Dahmer's home meant entering the very heart of darkness. The moment Edwards walked in, the stench of chemicals and decay was overwhelming. He noticed strange things: photographs on the wall of men posed in unnatural positions, a fish tank glowing eerily in the corner, the thick odor that seemed impossible to place. Dahmer offered him a drink laced with sedatives, but Edwards grew suspicious. He tried to refuse, but Dahmer was insistent, and his demeanor shifted from polite to predatory as the minutes passed. Edwards realized he was in danger, and the nightmare revealed itself. Dahmer lunged with a pair of handcuffs, clicking one around Edwards's wrist, but failing to secure the other. Edwards panicked, but Dahmer's strength and calmness terrified him. Dahmer threatened him, pulled a knife, and forced him deeper into the apartment. Inside, Edwards saw what no living person should have seen: bones, photographs, strange tools, and a barrel sitting ominously in the corner filled with acid. Dahmer played with the knife as he spoke softly about his fantasies, about wanting to control someone forever, about the things he had already done to others. Edwards's mind raced with terror, yet he tried desperately to remain calm, realizing his only chance of survival was to earn Dahmer's trust. He spoke gently, pretending to sympathize with Dahmer, asking if they could sit together in the living room. The killer's mood swung between menace and eerie affection as he rested his head on Edwards's chest, listening to his heartbeat whispering that he wanted to consume him, to become one with him. Edwards knew he had little time. Hours dragged on, but eventually, Edwards convinced Dahmer to return to the living room, where he waited for the smallest window of escape. As the television flickered in the background and Dahmer's attention wavered, Edwards made his move. He struck Dahmer, pushed him back, and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, the single handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He burst out of the apartment building into the streets of Milwaukee, where he flagged down 2 police officers in desperation. Gasping for breath, he told them about the man inside who had tried to kill him, about the strange smells, the knives, the photographs. The officers, skeptical at first, followed him back to apartment 213, unaware that they were about to walk into one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. When the police stepped inside, the odor was immediate and suffocating. They searched the apartment, and what they found was beyond comprehension. In the bedroom, they discovered Polaroids, hundreds of them, showing men in various stages of torture and dismemberment. The photographs were so graphic that one officer stepped back in horror, realizing they were not staged but real acts committed. In that very apartment, drawers revealed human remains, neatly preserved skulls lined up as though waiting for display. The refrigerator held a severed head wrapped in plastic, as well as bags of flesh stored like groceries. The freezer contained human meat preserved for later consumption, and the barrels of acid in the bedroom held decomposing remains dissolving slowly into sludge. Officers were stunned, unable to comprehend that this quiet man with a soft voice had been living in their city, carrying out such atrocities undetected for years. The evidence filled every corner, every surface, a grotesque museum of Dahmer's obsessions. Photographs of bodies posed like art, Polaroids of lifeless eyes staring back at the lens, skulls cleaned and bleached, jars filled with organs and hearts. All around them the horror spoke. Not just of murder, but of a mind consumed by the desire to own and consume his victims completely. It was evil displayed without disguise, and yet it had existed. For so long hidden behind polite smiles and ordinary appearances, as more detectives poured into the apartment, the true scope of Dahmer's crimes came into focus. He calmly admitted to everything, sitting quietly as officers cataloged his confessions. He described how he lured men home, how he drugged them, how he killed them, and what he did afterward. He spoke of eating parts of them not with rage, but with chilling matter-of-fact detail, explaining that consuming them made him feel as if they would never leave him. He described his failed attempts to create zombies, drilling holes into skulls, injecting acid or boiling water into brains in a grotesque effort to make his victims obedient living dolls. He admitted to keeping trophies because he wanted to relive the moments again and again, because the idea of being abandoned was unbearable. The detectives listened in disbelief, trying to reconcile the man in front of them with the horrors he described. The neighbors, too, were in shock. When the truth spread through the building, they recalled the foul odors, the sounds at night, the excuses Dahmer gave them, and realized that all along the nightmare had been unfolding just feet away. They remembered his quiet demeanor, his soft words, his occasional smile, and felt betrayed that they had been so close to evil without realizing it. The community as a whole recoiled in horror, struggling to accept that such brutality could exist not in shadows or distant lands, but in an ordinary apartment in Milwaukee. For the families of the victims, the discovery was shattering. For years, many had wondered what had happened to their sons, brothers, and loved ones, and now the truth was revealed in its most grotesque form. The grief was compounded by the details, each revelation cutting deeper than the last, as they learned how their loved ones had been lured, deceived, and destroyed. The photographs, the remains, the jars of organs were not just evidence. They were the last traces of lives stolen in silence by a man who had seemed so unremarkable. The pain was indescribable, the betrayal unbearable, and yet for the first time, there was an answer to the disappearances that had haunted them for so long. The investigation into Dahmer's apartment lasted for days as forensic teams carefully collected evidence, documenting every bone, every photograph, every tool of horror. The sheer volume of remains and evidence overwhelmed even experienced investigators who had never seen anything like it. Before the case quickly spread across national and international news, shocking the world with its brutality and its strange contradiction that a man so seemingly ordinary could be a monster of such scale. Journalists flooded Milwaukee reporters, broadcast leave from outside the Oxford apartments, and the name Jeffrey Dahmer became synonymous with evil. The images of officers carrying boxes of evidence, the acid-filled barrels, the photographs of skulls and bones, became burned into public memory forever. Through it all, Dahmer remained disturbingly calm. He offered no resistance during his arrest. He confessed openly to his crimes as if relieved that the secret was finally out. His lack of emotion, his quiet voice, and his matter-of-fact tone horrified the public almost as much as the crimes themselves. It was not just what he had done, but how easily he spoke of it, how detached he seemed from the humanity of his victims. His capture marked the end of a nightmare for the community. But it also raised questions that would linger for years about how he had gone unnoticed, how so many warning signs had been missed, and how darkness could live undetected in plain sight. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most disturbing and widely followed cases in American history. People crowded into the courtroom, eager and horrified to hear the details of his crimes, and the families of the victims sat in silence, their grief etched into every expression. The prosecution presented evidence so overwhelming that there could be no doubt. Photographs, human remains, journals, and Dahmer's own chilling confessions, all laid bare for the world to see. The defense attempted to argue insanity, that no sane person could commit acts of such depravity, but Dahmer himself rejected that idea. He told the court that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he was not insane but consumed by desires he could not control, he admitted. That he murdered not out of rage but because he wanted to possess people completely. He described his cannibalism and his attempts to make living zombies with a calm that unnerved even the most hardened observers. The testimonies of the victims. Families were heart-wrenching. Mothers spoke of sons they would never see again. Brothers wept as they recalled loved ones who vanished only to be found in Polaroids and bones. Children of the victims sat bewildered, unable to understand why someone would commit such horrors. One father screamed in court, demanding to know why his child had been taken from him. Others trembled with fury and grief as the details were read aloud. The pain was compounded by the fact that many of the victims came from marginalized communities, men of color, men from difficult circumstances, men society often overlooked, making them easy prey for Dahmer, who knew they would not be missed quickly. The weight of that truth added another layer of horror to the proceedings. The jury listened for weeks as evidence mounted, and as experts tried to explain the psychology of a man who had done the unthinkable. In the end, the conclusion was inevitable. Dahmer was found guilty of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, totaling more than 900 years. He would never walk free again. As the judge read the sentence, he declared that Dahmer should spend every day of his life behind bars without hope of release. The families of the victims wept, some relieved that justice had been served, others crushed by the reminder that nothing could bring their loved ones back. Dahmer himself sat quietly, his face devoid of emotion, as though the weight of the sentence meant nothing compared to the horrors he had already lived with inside his mind. Life in prison for Dahmer was not simple. He was hated by many inmates, despised for the nature of his crimes. He became a target, mocked, harassed, threatened. The guards tried to keep him safe, but even behind bars, his presence carried danger. He spent much of his time in isolation, but later he was allowed to interact more with other prisoners. He reportedly found religion, claiming he had been baptized in prison, and spoke occasionally about remorse, saying he wished he could die to spare the families further pain. Yet to many his words seemed hollow, too little, too late for the devastation he had caused. In November 1994, that reckoning came when Dahmer was assigned to a work detail cleaning with 2 other inmates. One of them, Christopher Scarver, had heard enough about Dahmer's crimes to feel rage burning inside him. Scarver attacked Dahmer with a metal bar in the prison gym and left him beaten to death. Dahmer died at 34. His life ended not by justice of the court, but by the hand of another prisoner. The news spread quickly across the world, shocking some, but relieving many. The families of the victims reacted in different ways, some expressing a sense of closure, others feeling that his death denied them the chance to watch him spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the world, it marked the end of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. Even after his death, Dahmer's story remained a haunting symbol of evil hiding in plain sight. His crimes forced society to question how someone so monstrous could go unnoticed for so long, how neighbors could smell decay, hear strange noises, and yet accept his excuses, how the system could fail to connect missing persons cases and give a predator freedom for over a decade. His name became infamous, etched alongside the darkest figures in history. His apartment building was eventually demolished because no one could live in a place so tainted by memory and horror. The site became an empty lot, a reminder of what had once happened there, and how a quiet man in an ordinary neighborhood hid one of the most grotesque secrets the world had ever known. What had once happened there, and how a quiet man in an ordinary neighborhood hid one of the most grotesque secrets the world had ever known. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just the story of a killer, but of the lives he destroyed. Each victim was a person with dreams, families, and futures stolen from them by his hands. Their names became part of the story, but too often overshadowed by the notoriety of the man who killed them. Yet they are the ones who deserve to be remembered, the ones whose absence tore holes in families and communities. The pain of their loss lingers still, the echoes of unanswered questions haunting those who loved them. Their lives remind the world that behind every statistic of crime there are faces, hearts, and stories that matter. The fascination with Dahmer continues. Documentaries, books, Dramatizations all attempting to answer the question of why he did what he did. Some argue he was driven by loneliness, others say he was born with a darkness that could never be cured. Some believe society's failures allowed him to thrive, preying on the vulnerable, while being overlooked by police again and again. Whatever the explanation may be, one truth remains clear: the horrors he created were real, and the suffering he caused immeasurable. His story is a reminder that evil often does not announce itself loudly. It often hides quietly in plain sight, wearing the mask of the ordinary. Jeffrey Dahmer's name will forever be associated with terror, but his story carries a warning as well. It is a warning about vigilance, about seeing the invisible, and about understanding the depth of human darkness. His life and death stand as proof that sometimes monsters do not lurk in shadows. They live next door. They smile politely. They blend into the world unnoticed until it is too late. The Milwaukee Cannibal is gone, but the legacy of his crimes endures, etched in history as one of the darkest chapters of true crime, reminding humanity of what happens when evil is allowed to grow unseen until it consumes everything in its path.